It was June 1944. A Soviet logistics officer named Colonel Dmitry Kovalev stood on a muddy road in Belarus, watching an endless column of trucks rolling east. They weren't Soviet GAZ or ZIS trucks with their distinctive boxy shapes and unreliable engines. They were American Studebaker US-6 trucks, thousands of them, painted Soviet green and driven by Red Army soldiers. Each truck carried 3 tons of ammunition, fuel, or supplies toward the front lines. The column stretched for kilometers, a mechanical river flowing through the wreckage of German occupation. Kovalev had fought since 1941 and remembered when Soviet armies moved on foot or horse-drawn wagons. Now they rode American wheels. He knew something profound had changed about Soviet military capabilities, something that German intelligence had completely failed to understand. The story of how American trucks transformed the Red Army begins not with military planning, but with ideological resistance. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin's regime had spent 2 decades proclaiming Soviet industrial self-sufficiency. Communist propaganda emphasized that socialism had created industrial power rivaling capitalist nations. Accepting aid from capitalist America contradicted this narrative fundamentally. Soviet ideology held that capitalism was decaying and socialism represented humanity's future. Admitting that Soviet industry couldn't produce enough trucks to equip the Red Army meant acknowledging that capitalist manufacturing was superior. This was politically unacceptable. We'll pause briefly before continuing. If stories like this are important to you, please consider supporting the video with a like and a subscription. After watching, a short comment, even a simple one, helps these stories reach further. Your support ensures they are not forgotten. Thank you. Let's continue. Stalin personally banned discussion of requesting American military aid during the first weeks of war. Soviet military officials who suggested that Lend-Lease assistance might be necessary faced accusations of defeatism or worse. The NKVD arrested several officers who compiled reports detailing Soviet truck production shortfalls. Stalin's position was clear. The Soviet Union would defeat Germany using Soviet-produced weapons and Soviet-manufactured vehicles. Any suggestion that American aid was essential undermined the ideological foundations of the Soviet state. This ideological rigidity nearly cost the Soviet Union the war, but reality has a way of overwhelming ideology. By autumn 1941, Soviet losses were catastrophic. German forces had destroyed or captured millions of tons of Soviet military equipment. Soviet truck production couldn't replace the losses. Factories that manufactured vehicles had been evacuated east ahead of German advances or destroyed by German bombers. The remaining production facilities couldn't produce enough trucks to maintain Soviet armies' mobility. Soviet forces increasingly relied on horse-drawn transport, exactly as Russian armies had in World War I. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was strategically fatal. Modern warfare required mechanized logistics. Armies that moved supplies by horse couldn't sustain offensive operations or respond quickly to German breakthroughs. Stalin faced a choice between ideological purity and military survival. In October 1941, he quietly authorized Soviet diplomats to request American aid under the Lend-Lease program that President Roosevelt had established to support Britain. The authorization came with strict conditions. Soviet requests would emphasize raw materials and industrial equipment, not finished military hardware. The propaganda line would be that the Soviet Union needed materials to feed its own superior manufacturing capabilities. Under no circumstances would Soviet propaganda acknowledge that American weapons or vehicles were better than Soviet equivalents. This face-saving fiction allowed Stalin to accept aid without completely abandoning ideological positions. The American response shocked Soviet officials with its scale and speed. Roosevelt and his advisors recognized that Soviet survival was essential for defeating Germany. If the Soviet Union collapsed, Germany would control resources from the Atlantic to the Urals. Britain would face invasion and likely defeat. America would confront a Nazi empire spanning Europe and possibly threatening the Western Hemisphere. Keeping the Soviet Union fighting was America's strategic priority, regardless of ideological differences. Roosevelt authorized massive Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, including the one category of equipment that would prove most important: trucks. The Studebaker US-6 truck became the symbol of American aid to the Soviet Union, though it was far from the only vehicle America supplied. The US-6 was a 2.5-ton truck designed for military logistics. It featured 6-wheel drive, allowing it to operate on poor roads and cross-country terrain. The engine was a Hercules JXD 6-cylinder gasoline engine producing 94 horsepower. This seems modest by modern standards, but was adequate for 1940s requirements. The truck could carry 3 tons of cargo or tow artillery pieces. Its fuel consumption was high by Soviet standards, but acceptable given that American aid included fuel supplies. What made the Studebaker revolutionary for Soviet operations wasn't any single technical feature. It was reliability. Soviet trucks of the era, primarily GAZ-AA and ZIS-5 models, were mechanically unreliable. They required constant maintenance, broke down frequently, and had short operational lifespans. Soviet military logistics officers planned operations assuming that 30% of their truck fleet would be non-operational at any given time. This meant Soviet forces needed 3 trucks to reliably transport the load that one truck could theoretically carry. The inefficiency was crippling. The Studebaker, by contrast, was reliable under conditions that destroyed Soviet trucks. American manufacturing quality meant that Studebakers kept running despite poor maintenance, terrible roads, and brutal weather. The first Studebakers arrived in the Soviet Union in late 1942 via multiple routes. Some came through Persian Corridor, shipped to Iran, and then driven north through Soviet Azerbaijan. Others arrived at Murmansk and Arkhangelsk on Arctic convoys that braved German submarine attacks. A few came via the Pacific route, shipped to Vladivostok, and then transported across Siberia by rail. By early 1943, Studebakers were reaching Soviet forces in significant numbers. By war's end, America had delivered over 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, including approximately 200,000 Studebakers. This represented more trucks than Soviet industry produced during the entire war. Soviet military commanders initially resisted using American trucks. The resistance was partly ideological, but also practical. Soviet maintenance crews were trained on Soviet vehicles. They didn't have spare parts, technical manuals, or tools for American trucks. The Studebaker used different bolt sizes than Soviet vehicles, requiring separate tool sets. Its gasoline engine was less fuel efficient than Soviet diesel engines, creating logistics challenges. Many Soviet officers argued that resources spent adapting to American vehicles would be better spent increasing production of familiar Soviet trucks. This resistance was strongest among political officers and generals who had risen through ideological loyalty rather than military competence. But practical commanders recognized immediately what American trucks meant for Soviet operational capabilities. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, architect of Soviet victory at Stalingrad and Kursk, was among the first senior officers to advocate for maximum use of Lend-Lease trucks. Zhukov understood that mobility was decisive in modern warfare. The side that could move supplies faster, concentrate forces more quickly, and exploit breakthroughs more effectively would win. Soviet trucks couldn't provide this mobility. American trucks could. Zhukov overruled ideological objections and ordered his logistics officers to prioritize Studebaker distribution to mobile forces, particularly tank armies and mechanized corps. The transformation of Soviet logistics capabilities that resulted was nothing short of revolutionary. Soviet offensive operations before 1943 were characterized by initial success, followed by rapid culmination as supply lines couldn't sustain advancing forces. Soviet armies would break through German defenses, advance 50 to 100 kilometers, and then stall as ammunition and fuel ran out. German forces would counterattack against stalled Soviet formations, often recapturing lost territory. This cycle repeated throughout 1941 and 1942. Soviet forces could win tactical victories but couldn't sustain operational momentum. American trucks changed this dynamic fundamentally. Soviet formations equipped with Studebakers could sustain advances deep into German rear areas. Supply trucks could keep pace with advancing tank armies, delivering ammunition and fuel to forces hundreds of kilometers from railheads. This allowed Soviet forces to conduct deep operations, the style of warfare that Soviet military theorists had developed in the 1930s but couldn't execute due to logistics limitations. Deep operations involved rapid penetration through enemy defenses, followed by exploitation into operational depth, destroying enemy reserves and command structures before they could organize coherent defense. This required mobile logistics that Soviet trucks couldn't provide, but American trucks could. The impact became visible during Operation Bagration in summer 1944. Soviet forces destroyed German Army Group Center in 6 weeks, advancing over 600 kilometers from Belarus to Poland. The operation succeeded partly because of Soviet tactical improvements and German weaknesses. But it succeeded fundamentally because Soviet logistics could sustain the advance. American trucks moved supplies from railheads to advancing forces continuously. Soviet armies didn't stall for lack of ammunition or fuel as they had in previous operations. German commanders were shocked by Soviet forces' ability to maintain operational tempo. Wehrmacht intelligence had assessed that Soviet logistics would limit advances to 200 kilometers maximum. The assessment was based on Soviet truck capabilities. It didn't account for American trucks that had transformed Soviet logistics. The Katyusha rocket launcher provides another example of how American trucks amplified Soviet weapons effectiveness. The Katyusha, properly designated BM-13, was a multiple rocket launcher mounted on truck chassis. Soviet engineers had mounted early Katyushas on Soviet ZIS-6 trucks, but these vehicles were unreliable and scarce. American Studebakers became the standard Katyusha platform. The truck's 6-wheel drive allowed Katyusha units to position on rough terrain, launch devastating salvos, and rapidly relocate before German counter-battery fire could respond. This mobility made Katyushas far more effective than they would have been on stationary platforms or less capable vehicles. German soldiers gave the Katyusha the nickname Stalin's organ because of the distinctive sound of its rockets in flight. But they might more accurately have called it Roosevelt's organ because American trucks provided the mobility that made the weapon system effective. German intelligence eventually recognized that Soviet Katyusha units increasingly rode on American trucks. This should have alerted Wehrmacht commanders that Soviet logistics capabilities had fundamentally changed. But German intelligence analysis remained focused on Soviet weapons rather than the American vehicles that made those weapons operationally effective. The strategic implications of American truck deliveries extended beyond immediate battlefield impact. Soviet industry during the war focused on producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons. Soviet factories built over 100,000 tanks and self-propelled guns during the war. They manufactured over 100,000 aircraft. Artillery production exceeded 500,000 pieces. This industrial mobilization was extraordinary, but it was only possible because Soviet industry didn't have to produce trucks in comparable quantities. American trucks freed Soviet manufacturing capacity to focus on weapons production. The counterfactual is instructive. If Soviet industry had needed to produce the 400,000 trucks that America supplied, those resources couldn't have been used for other military production. Soviet tank production would have been reduced by perhaps 30% to free manufacturing capacity for trucks. Aircraft production would have suffered similarly. Soviet armies would have had more trucks but fewer tanks and planes. The strategic exchange would have been catastrophic. Trucks are essential, but tanks win battles. American trucks allowed Soviet industry to focus on combat vehicles, while American manufacturing provided logistics vehicles. This division of labor optimized both nations' contributions to defeating Germany. The human stories behind the trucks reveal dimensions that statistics cannot capture. Sergeant Ivan Petrov was a truck driver in a Soviet supply unit. He learned to drive on Soviet Gaz trucks, temperamental machines that required constant mechanical attention. In spring 1943, his unit received Studebakers. Petrov described the experience decades later as transformative. The American truck started reliably in cold weather, something Soviet trucks rarely did. It didn't break down constantly. The cab was relatively comfortable. The truck could navigate terrible roads that would have immobilized Soviet vehicles. Petrov said driving a Studebaker felt like entering the future. It was his first direct experience with American industrial quality, and it permanently shaped his views about capitalism's capabilities, despite decades of Soviet propaganda emphasizing socialist superiority. The maintenance crews who serviced American trucks faced challenges adapting to unfamiliar equipment. Soviet mechanics were trained to work with minimal tools and inadequate spare parts. They became experts at improvising repairs using whatever materials were available. American trucks, with their higher build quality, required less improvisation but demanded different technical knowledge. The engines were more complex than Soviet designs. The electrical systems used different components. Soviet mechanics gradually developed expertise maintaining American vehicles, but the learning process was difficult. Some units experienced higher breakdown rates initially because mechanics applied Soviet maintenance practices to American equipment with poor results. The spare parts supply presented ongoing challenges throughout the war. American Lend-Lease deliveries included spare parts for the trucks, but quantities were often inadequate for Soviet forces' needs. Soviet usage patterns were harsher than American military planners anticipated. Soviet drivers operated trucks in worse conditions, with less maintenance support and with heavier loads than American doctrine recommended. This accelerated wear on components. Soviet forces improvised by cannibalizing damaged trucks for parts. They also developed hybrid maintenance approaches, replacing failed American components with Soviet equivalents when possible. These adaptations worked adequately but never perfectly. The fuel supply was another ongoing issue. Studebakers used gasoline, while Soviet military logistics increasingly emphasized diesel fuel for its lower flammability and better cold weather performance. Soviet forces operating American trucks needed separate fuel supply chains for gasoline. This complicated logistics and created vulnerabilities. German forces that captured Soviet fuel dumps might find diesel that was useless for captured Soviet tanks, but gasoline that worked perfectly in Soviet-operated American trucks. These complexities meant that some Soviet commanders preferred Soviet diesel trucks, despite their reliability problems, because they simplified fuel logistics. Despite these challenges, Soviet forces became increasingly dependent on American trucks as the war progressed. By 1944, approximately two-thirds of Soviet truck fleet consisted of American vehicles. The most mobile Soviet formations, the tank armies, and mechanized corps that conducted deep operations were almost entirely equipped with American trucks. The Studebaker became so ubiquitous in Soviet military operations that soldiers simply called them Studers. an affectionate nickname that acknowledged their importance. Soviet propaganda still portrayed the war as Soviet industrial achievement, but Soviet soldiers knew that American wheels carried Soviet armies to Berlin. The political implications of this dependence created tensions that persisted throughout and after the war. Stalin recognized that American aid was militarily essential but ideologically embarrassing. Soviet propaganda minimized Lend-Lease's importance, emphasizing that Soviet forces did the fighting and dying while Americans merely provided supplies. This narrative had truth to it. Soviet military casualties dwarfed American losses, but it obscured how critically American logistics support enabled Soviet military operations. Without American trucks, Soviet forces couldn't have conducted the mobile warfare that destroyed German armies from 1943 onward. American officials had mixed feelings about Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. Some viewed it as essential strategic investment that helped defeat Germany while minimizing American casualties. Others worried that American aid was building Soviet power that would threaten American interests after Germany's defeat. These tensions increased as the war progressed, and post-war Soviet intentions became clearer. By 1945, some American officials advocated reducing Lend-Lease deliveries to the Soviet Union to limit Soviet post-war capabilities. But Roosevelt and his military advisors maintained support through war's end, prioritizing German defeat over post-war considerations. The end of Lend-Lease deliveries after Germany's surrender created immediate crisis for Soviet logistics. American shipments stopped abruptly in May 1945. Soviet forces preparing for invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria suddenly faced equipment shortages. Stalin protested bitterly, arguing that American aid should continue until Japan's defeat. But American officials, no longer facing German threat and increasingly concerned about Soviet intentions, declined to resume large-scale deliveries. This abrupt termination embittered Stalin and contributed to deteriorating Soviet-American relations that would become the Cold War. Soviet industry after the war focused on replacing American trucks with Soviet-produced vehicles. Soviet engineers studied Studebakers and other American trucks extensively, incorporating design features into Soviet post-war vehicle development. The ZIS-150 truck, introduced in 1947, borrowed extensively from American designs Soviet engineers had examined during the war. Soviet military logistics throughout the Cold War reflected lessons learned from operating American trucks during World War II. Soviet doctrine emphasized mechanized logistics and mobile operations that had only become possible through American truck deliveries. The memory of American trucks in Soviet service remained sensitive subject throughout the Cold War. Soviet official histories minimized Lend-Lease's importance, following Stalin's propaganda line that Soviet industrial might had defeated Germany. Veterans who fought in the war knew better. They remembered riding in Studebakers, sleeping under American tarpaulins, and eating American canned food. These memories created cognitive dissonance with official propaganda about capitalist inferiority. Some veterans spoke openly about American aid despite official disapproval. Others remained silent, recognizing that acknowledging dependence on capitalist aid could bring political trouble. The German perspective on Soviet use of American trucks revealed intelligence failures that contributed to Wehrmacht defeat. German intelligence services documented increasing American truck presence in Soviet units from 1943 onward. Photo reconnaissance showed Studebakers and other American vehicles throughout Soviet rear areas. But German analysts failed to appreciate what this meant for Soviet operational capabilities. They continued to assess Soviet logistics based on Soviet truck production figures, underestimating Soviet forces' ability to sustain offensives. This analytical failure meant German commanders were repeatedly surprised by Soviet forces' operational depth. Wehrmacht planning assumed Soviet advances would culminate after relatively short distances. Reality proved these assumptions wrong because Soviet logistics, powered by American trucks, could sustain much deeper operations. The question of whether the Soviet Union could have defeated Germany without American Lend-Lease is counterfactual but important. Soviet forces did the fighting. Soviet soldiers died in millions defending their homeland and advancing to Berlin. But Soviet forces couldn't have sustained the mobile operations that destroyed German armies without American logistics support. A Soviet Union fighting Germany without American trucks would have won eventually through attrition and German resource exhaustion. But the war would have lasted longer and cost millions more Soviet lives. American trucks didn't win the war for the Soviet Union, but they made Soviet victory faster and less costly in blood. The irony of Soviet dependence on capitalist manufacturing for military success wasn't lost on everyone. Some Soviet officials privately acknowledged that American industrial superiority made Lend-Lease possible. American factories produced enough military vehicles to equip the American military, supply Britain and other allies, and deliver hundreds of thousands of trucks to the Soviet Union simultaneously. Soviet industry at peak production couldn't match this output despite having larger population and comparable natural resources. The implication was uncomfortable. Perhaps capitalist manufacturing systems were more efficient than socialist central planning. This conclusion was ideologically unacceptable, so it remained largely unspoken. But it influenced some Soviet economic planners who recognized that industrial efficiency required elements of market mechanism even in planned economy. The legacy of Lend-Lease trucks extended beyond their immediate wartime impact. American trucks gave millions of Soviet soldiers direct experience with American manufacturing quality. They saw firsthand that capitalist industry could produce reliable, well-designed products. This experience couldn't be entirely erased by propaganda. Veterans returned to civilian life after the war with knowledge that American trucks were better than Soviet equivalents. This knowledge spread through Soviet society despite official efforts to minimize American aid's importance. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda about capitalist inferiority and personal experience with superior American products contributed to slow erosion of ideological certainty that would eventually contribute to Soviet systems' collapse decades later. Modern Russian historians have struggled with how to address Lend-Lease in accounts of World War II. Soviet-era histories minimized it systematically. Post-Soviet Russian histories have been more willing to acknowledge American aid's importance. But the acknowledgement comes with continued emphasis on Soviet sacrifice and Soviet achievements. The narrative remains that Soviet forces defeated Germany primarily through their own efforts. American trucks helped, but they were supplementary rather than essential. This interpretation maintains Russian national pride while partially acknowledging historical reality. It's not entirely accurate, but it's politically necessary for Russian historical memory. American perspectives on Lend-Lease have evolved differently. During the Cold War, some American accounts exaggerated Lend-Lease's importance to diminish Soviet military achievements. These accounts suggested that Soviet forces couldn't have functioned without American aid. This overstatement served Cold War propaganda purposes, but distorted historical reality. More balanced post-Cold War American histories acknowledge that Lend-Lease was significant, but not solely responsible for Soviet victory. Soviet forces would have defeated Germany regardless. American aid made that victory faster and enabled mobile operations that shortened the war. This more nuanced assessment better reflects the complex relationship between American manufacturing, Soviet fighting, and German defeat. The Studebaker trucks that transformed Soviet logistics were themselves transformed by the experience. American engineers received feedback about how their trucks performed under conditions American designers hadn't anticipated. Soviet usage patterns were harsh, Roads were worse, maintenance was limited, and operational requirements exceeded design specifications. The truck survived these conditions better than expected, validating American manufacturing quality. But the experience also identified improvements that American engineers incorporated into post-war designs. The trucks that American forces used in Korea and Vietnam benefited from lessons learned by Soviet forces driving Studebakers from Moscow to Berlin. The economic dimension of Lend-Lease remains contentious. The Soviet Union nominally agreed to repay Lend-Lease aid after the war, but the repayment terms were vague and Soviet compliance was minimal. Stalin argued that Soviet blood spilled defeating Germany was payment enough for American supplies. American officials countered that Lend-Lease was aid, not gift, and that agreements required repayment. The dispute soured post-war relations and was never satisfactorily resolved. Even today, there are disagreements about what the Soviet Union received, what it used, and what should have been repaid. The economic argument obscures the strategic reality. American Lend-Lease was investment in defeating Germany. It achieved that objective. The return on investment was German defeat, which served American strategic interests regardless of Soviet repayment. The technological transfer that occurred through Lend-Lease had implications beyond trucks. Soviet engineers studied every piece of American equipment they received. Trucks, aircraft, radios, weapons, and industrial machinery were examined, tested, and often reverse engineered. Soviet industry incorporated American design features into its products throughout and after the war. This technological transfer accelerated Soviet industrial development and narrowed the technology gap between Soviet and American capabilities. Some American officials worried about this at the time, recognizing that Lend-Lease was educating a potential future adversary, but defeating Germany was immediate priority that outweighed concerns about potential future Soviet threat. The human dimension of this technology transfer deserves attention. Soviet soldiers and mechanics who worked with American trucks gained respect for American engineering and manufacturing. This respect extended beyond the equipment to questions about the society that could produce such equipment in such quantities. Some Soviet citizens began questioning whether capitalist systems might have advantages over socialist planned economies. These doubts were dangerous in Stalin's Soviet Union, where ideological deviation could mean death or imprisonment. Most people kept their doubts private, but the seeds of doubt planted by experience with American manufacturing quality would eventually grow into broader questions about Soviet systems' viability. The contrast between ideological prohibition and practical necessity that Lend-Lease trucks represented was characteristic of Soviet systems' contradictions. Ideology said capitalist products were inferior. Reality demonstrated they were superior. Ideology said Soviet industry was self-sufficient. Reality showed it needed massive American aid to equip Soviet armies. These contradictions between ideology and reality couldn't be permanently suppressed. Soviet citizens who served in the war knew the truth about American aid, regardless of what propaganda claimed. This knowledge persisted through generations, gradually eroding the ideological certainty that sustained Soviet system. The Studebakers that carried Soviet armies to Berlin also carried seeds of doubt that would eventually contribute to Soviet system's dissolution. The specific tactical advantages American trucks provided deserve deeper examination through concrete battlefield examples. During the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, Soviet forces advanced over 600 kilometers in less than 3 weeks. This operational tempo was unprecedented. Soviet tank armies led the advance, but their success depended entirely on supply trucks maintaining pace. Major Alexei Volkov commanded a truck battalion supporting the 1st Guards Tank Army during this operation. His battalion consisted entirely of Studebakers, over 300 trucks moving ammunition and fuel forward continuously. Volkov calculated that his battalion moved over 15,000 tons of supplies during the offensive's 3 weeks. Without those supplies, the tank army would have stalled after advancing 100 kilometers. With them, it reached the Oder River. The Battle of Königsberg in April 1945 provided another example of American trucks' tactical impact. Soviet forces surrounded the heavily fortified Prussian city and began systematic reduction of its defences. The operation required enormous ammunition expenditure. Soviet artillery fired over 300,000 shells during the battle. Captain Sergei Kuznetsov commanded an artillery supply unit equipped with Studebakers. His trucks made continuous trips from ammunition dumps to gun positions over roads pulverized by artillery fire and blocked by rubble. Kuznetsov emphasized the Studebakers' cross-country capability. When roads became impassable, his trucks could navigate through adjacent fields or forests. Königsberg fell in 4 days rather than the estimated 2 weeks because Soviet artillery could sustain intense bombardment without ammunition shortages. The human cost of truck driving in combat zones receives insufficient historical attention. Truck drivers faced constant dangers from air attack, artillery fire, and partisan activity. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Orlov was a truck driver who completed the war with over 100 supply runs into combat zones. He survived 3 ambushes, 2 air attacks, and 1 artillery barrage that destroyed 4 trucks in his convoy. Orlov estimated that his battalion lost approximately 15% of its drivers, killed or wounded during the war. This casualty rate exceeded that of some combat units, but truck drivers received less recognition than frontline soldiers. The maintenance infrastructure supporting American trucks was massive but largely invisible. Soviet forces established specialized repair facilities for American vehicles throughout rear areas. Colonel Boris Petrov commanded a central repair facility in Ukraine that specialized in American truck maintenance. His facility could overhaul 100 trucks simultaneously. Petrov's biggest challenge was spare parts supply. American Lend-Lease shipments included parts, but never enough for Soviet forces' intensive vehicle usage. Petrov's mechanics learned to improvise, manufacturing certain parts in the facility's machine shop, adapting Soviet components when possible, and cannibalizing damaged trucks beyond repair for parts to fix repairable vehicles. The fuel logistics supporting American trucks deserve particular attention. Studebakers consumed approximately 40 litres of gasoline per 100 kilometres. Soviet forces needed separate gasoline supply chains parallel to diesel infrastructure. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Markov was a fuel supply officer responsible for maintaining fuel stocks for a Soviet front. His jurisdiction included over 40,000 trucks, roughly 2/3 of them American. Markov calculated that American trucks consumed approximately 20% more fuel per ton-kilometre than Soviet diesel trucks. But American trucks were more reliable and faster, completing more trips per day. The net effect was that American trucks were actually more fuel efficient in terms of ton-kilometres delivered per unit of fuel consumed. The cultural exchange that occurred through Lend-Lease extended beyond military cooperation. American truck drivers who delivered vehicles to Soviet forces at transfer points had direct contact with Red Army soldiers. These interactions generated mutual respect despite ideological differences. American drivers recognized that Soviet soldiers had endured horrors that Americans couldn't imagine. Soviet soldiers saw that Americans were decent people despite propaganda portraying them as capitalist exploiters. These human connections didn't eliminate ideological differences, but created small pockets of understanding that persisted through subsequent decades of hostility. The statistical impact of American trucks on Soviet logistics is documented but deserves emphasis. By war's end, American trucks constituted approximately 60% of Soviet truck fleet. This percentage was even higher in mobile formations. Tank armies and mechanized corps, The forces that conducted deep operations were equipped almost exclusively with American trucks. The concentration of American vehicles in elite formations reflected conscious Soviet prioritization. The most capable units received the most reliable equipment. The impact on Soviet post-war military doctrine was profound and lasting. Soviet military planners recognized that mobile operations required mechanized logistics on scale that Soviet industry alone couldn't provide. Post-war Soviet military development prioritized truck production and logistics infrastructure. The Soviet Union established design bureaus specifically for military truck development that studied American trucks extensively and incorporated American design features into Soviet vehicles. Soviet strategic planning during early Cold War assumed that any future conflict with NATO would require logistics on even larger scale than World War II. This drove massive investment in Soviet truck manufacturing that continued throughout the Cold War. The role of women in driving and maintaining American trucks deserves recognition. Soviet forces mobilized women extensively for rear area duties, including truck driving and vehicle maintenance. Lieutenant Anna Sokolova commanded a women's truck platoon equipped with Studebakers. Her platoon conducted ammunition supply runs for artillery units during the final year of war. Sokolova's platoon completed over 1,000 supply runs without losing a truck to mechanical failure. Their record vindicated her argument that women could drive and maintain trucks as effectively as men. The environmental conditions under which American trucks operated in Soviet service tested their design parameters beyond American planners' expectations. Russian winter temperatures regularly reached -30 degrees Celsius or lower. Soviet forces learned techniques for operating American trucks in these conditions, using improvised block heaters, diluting lubricants with kerosene, and wrapping engines in insulated covers. The successful adaptation demonstrated both vehicle quality and Soviet ingenuity. Summer conditions were equally challenging as Soviet roads dissolved into impassable mud. The Studebaker's six-wheel drive was essential for operating in these conditions. The diplomatic dimension of Lend-Lease remained contentious throughout the war and after. Soviet requests for equipment were often broader than American willingness to supply. Stalin wanted latest American technology, including advanced aircraft and electronics. American officials were reluctant to share cutting-edge technology with regime they distrusted. These tensions reflected deeper political differences that would explode into Cold War hostility after Germany's defeat. The legacy of this cooperation was paradoxical. It helped defeat common enemy, but created no lasting alliance. American trucks that helped Soviet forces reach Berlin also helped create powerful Soviet military that would threaten Western Europe throughout Cold War. American officials who approved Lend-Lease knew this was possibility. They calculated that defeating Germany was immediate imperative that justified strengthening potential future adversary. The human bonds created through Lend-Lease cooperation were genuine but fragile. Soviet veterans who spoke too positively about Americans faced political suspicion during Cold War. The paranoid atmosphere made it safer to minimize American aid's importance. Only with Soviet systems collapse in 1991 did fuller discussion of Lend-Lease become possible in Russia. Post-Soviet historians began acknowledging American aid's importance more openly. Memoirs and documents that had been suppressed were published. Veterans who had remained silent for decades began sharing their memories of American trucks and equipment. This historical recovery was important for understanding how World War II was actually won. The victory was joint effort involving American industrial might, Soviet military sacrifice, and British strategic persistence. Each nation's contribution was essential. None could have won alone. The trucks that powered Soviet armies to Berlin symbolized this necessary cooperation between systems that would soon become adversaries. What began as banned idea became foundation of Soviet victory, shocking everyone who underestimated what could be achieved when nations combined their strengths against common enemy.